How does an entire family sleep through a blizzard inside a tent made of sticks and animal skin and wake up alive? Not just alive. Warm. Stand on the Great Plains in the middle of January and you will understand why that question matters. The wind does not gust here. It presses. Etunidas. It moves across 500 miles of open flatland with nothing to slow it down, nothing to soften it, nothing to stop it from finding every gap in every layer you are wearing. Temperatures drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. That is not cold. That is the temperature at which exposed skin begins to die within minutes. A modern survivalist with thousands of dollars of gear would call one night out there a serious challenge. An unprepared person would not see morning. And yet, for centuries, entire families, grandparents, mothers, infants, children, slept through storms exactly like that, inside a structure that looked, from the outside, almost fragile. No concrete. No insulation foam. No heating system. No glass. Just poles, hides, fire, and something far more powerful than any of those things. Knowledge old enough that no one remembers who first discovered it. By the end of this, you will never look at a simple shelter the same way again. Because what was happening inside that cone of hide and wood was not primitive survival. It was engineering. And the most important secret was never the fire. The first thing you notice about a tipi is the shape. And the first mistake most people make is thinking that shape was chosen for simplicity. It was not. Every angle of that cone was a decision made by generations of people who had watched wind destroy things and learned exactly how to stop it. When a storm hits a flat wall, it pushes. It finds pressure points, it stresses joints, it looks for weakness until something breaks. But when that same storm hits a cone, something different happens. The wind has nowhere to push against. It splits, wraps around the curved surface, and continues past. The structure does not fight the storm. It redirects it. Snow that would pile dangerously on a flat roof slides, clean down the sloped sides and falls to the ground. The tipi simply sheds what would destroy anything else. Modern engineers spend enormous resources designing stadiums, bridges, and skyscrapers to handle wind load. Plains tribes solved the same problem centuries earlier, with wooden poles and the geometry of a cone. The poles themselves, long lodgepole pine or cedar, tied near the top, leaned inward in a way that made the entire frame flex slightly under pressure rather than resist and collapse. Over that skeleton, thick buffalo hides were stretched tight and anchored to the ground. And in winter, a second liner was hung several feet inside the first, trapping a silent layer of air between the two walls. That air went nowhere. And because it went nowhere, neither did the warmth. The cone was not a shape chosen for beauty. It was chosen by the wind itself. But the structure was only half the secret. The other half was alive, and it was burning. At the center of every tipi, there was a fire. But if you imagine a roaring blaze throwing light against the walls, you are imagining the wrong thing entirely. The fire that kept a family alive through a plains blizzard was not large. It was controlled. It was almost quiet. Plains tribes understood something that takes modern people a long time to learn, that a massive fire is not a warm fire. It is a hungry fire. It consumes fuel faster than it can be gathered, fills enclosed spaces with smoke that burns lungs and blinds eyes, and creates violent temperature swings that make the body work harder instead of rest. What these families maintained through the night was something closer to a conversation with combustion. Small, steady, deliberate. Hardwood burned down to glowing embers, then covered lightly with ash to slow the release and preserve the heat until morning. A single stir before dawn could bring it back to life without a single new piece of wood. But the true genius was not the fire itself. It was what sat directly above it. Near the top of every tipi, two adjustable flaps of hide could be repositioned depending on which direction the wind was blowing. When angled correctly, those flaps created a natural draft, pulling smoke upward and out, while simultaneously keeping warm air circulating inside the shelter. It functioned like a lung, inhaling cold oxygen at the base, exhaling smoke at the crown, breathing steadily through the worst storms of the year. Somewhere tonight, In a building you probably trust completely, a ventilation system is failing to do what two pieces of hide did perfectly centuries ago. And picture this, a mother awake at 3 in the morning, blizzard screaming outside, watching a handful of embers the size of her fist hold the line between her sleeping children and 40 degrees below zero. That was not primitive. That was precision. But fire, no matter how brilliant, cannot fight the enemy beneath your feet. Most people fear the wind. They should fear the ground. Wind is visible, wind is loud, wind announces itself before it arrives. But frozen earth is silent. It makes no sound and no warning as it pulls heat directly out of anything touching its surface. This is not a feeling. This is physics. Conduction, direct contact between a warm body and a cold surface, drains heat from living tissue faster than wind ever could. In fact, frozen ground steals warmth from a sleeping body approximately 25 times faster than cold air at the same temperature. 25 times. That number is not a metaphor. It is the difference between waking up and not waking up. Plains tribes understood this long before any laboratory confirmed it, and so they built upward from the earth with the same careful intention they gave to every other part of the shelter. First came a layer of dry grass, reeds, or willow branches, not for comfort, but to interrupt contact. Above that came woven mats. Above that came buffalo robes, elk hides, deer skins, and layers of fur that trapped microscopic pockets of warm air between every fiber. Each layer did not simply add softness. Each layer added distance between a sleeping body and the frozen world beneath it. The child sleeping deepest inside those furs had no idea that the layers beneath her were the only thing standing between her heartbeat and the frozen earth below. Today, every serious mountaineer carries an insulated sleeping pad for exactly this reason. The science has a different name now. The principle is identical. But here is what the insulated pad, the sleeping bag, and the down jacket cannot replicate. The other heat source inside that teepee was not manufactured. It could not be bought, packed, or carried in a bag. It was breathing right beside you. And it was enough to change everything. There is a moment, somewhere deep in a plains winter night, when the fire has burned down to almost nothing, and the temperature outside has dropped past the point where survival becomes a question of minutes rather than hours. In that moment, the most powerful heating system inside the teepee was not made of wood or hide or engineered airflow. It was made of people. An average adult human body generates approximately 80 watts of heat, continuously, the equivalent of a light bulb burning through the night without ever needing fuel. Multiply that across a family of 6, 8, 10 people, sharing an enclosed space, and the thermal mathematics become remarkable. Plains families did not sleep together because they lacked privacy or space. They slept together because they understood, without ever writing it down, that shared warmth was a survival strategy as reliable as any fire. The arrangement was never random. Children were placed deepest into the layered bedding where insulation was thickest. Infants were wrapped tight in fur and held between adult bodies, their small frames incapable of generating enough heat alone to survive the night. Elders stayed closest to the fire, where warmth was most concentrated. Even dogs brought inside during the worst storms contributed body heat to the collective system. Every body had a position. Every position had a reason. Modern society has spent the last century designing homes and bedrooms specifically to maximize individual separation, thicker walls, private rooms, personal climate control. And in doing so, quietly abandoned one of the oldest and most effective survival strategies the human species ever developed. There is something worth sitting with in that thought. In the coldest nights these families ever faced, they did not survive by being strong. They survived by being close. But even that closeness, that shared warmth, that careful arrangement of bodies against the dark, none of it could hold if the walls themselves failed. And the walls had a secret that almost no one ever talks about. Here is something that will change the way you see the Tipi forever. It was never sealed shut. Not completely. Not even in the worst storms of the year. And that was not a flaw. That was the most sophisticated decision in the entire design. The greatest misconception people carry about the Tipi is that survival required sealing every gap, blocking every draft, creating a perfectly airtight shell against the outside world. But airtight is not warm. Airtight is a trap. A sealed space with a fire inside it does not stay warm. It fills with carbon dioxide, then carbon monoxide. Then it kills everyone sleeping inside it, quietly and without warning. What Plains families built instead was something far more elegant. The interior hide liner hung several feet inside the outer wall, created a chamber, a column of air that moved in a specific, deliberate direction. Cold air entered near the base of the structure where the liner met the ground, was gradually warmed by the fire at the center, rose naturally toward the smoke opening at the top, and carried the smoke out with it as it left. Fresh oxygen continuously replaced it from below. The entire shelter was cycling air constantly, invisibly, silently feeding the fire exactly what it needed to keep burning, removing exactly what would have made the air dangerous, and maintaining warmth without ever becoming a sealed tomb. It was not a tent. It was a lung. And like a lung, it adapted. In summer, the lower edges of the outer hides could be raised to invite cross-ventilation and cooling. In winter, everything was drawn tight against wind and snow, but never completely, never carelessly. The balance between open and closed was managed daily, adjusted for each storm, read from the behavior of smoke inside the shelter, the way a sailor reads wind from the surface of water. Many wooden cabins built later by settlers on those same plains trapped moisture, stale air, and smoke far worse than the structures they considered primitive. The Tipi did not keep nature out. It let nature in exactly as much as it needed, exactly where it was useful, and no more. But none of this breathed without one creature that made every layer, every liner, every robe, every rope possible. And that creature was disappearing. There is a word that appears in almost every account of Plains survival, written or spoken, ancient or modern. That word is buffalo. Not because it was the most dramatic element of the story, but because without it, there was no story. Remove the buffalo from the teepee, and what remains is a skeleton of poles standing naked in a blizzard. The outer walls gone. The interior liner gone. The robes on the sleeping children gone. The cordage holding the poles together gone. The fuel carried and stored for winter fires gone. The buffalo was not a resource. It was the architecture. A single winter hide, taken at the right season when the fur had grown to its fullest thickness, could block wind that would cut through layers of woven fabric in minutes. Partially damp hide retained warmth better than most textiles ever manufactured. The fat rendered from the animal waterproofed seams. The sinew stitched every panel together with a strength that outlasted seasons. Bones became tools for working the hides. Nothing, not a single part of that animal, was considered anything less than necessary. But here is what the history books rarely say directly. When settlers arrived on the plains and began hunting buffalo, not for survival but for commerce, slaughtering millions across decades, until the herds that had darkened the horizon, like living storm clouds, were reduced to near nothing. They did not only destroy an animal, they dismantled a system. Every hide that disappeared was a wall that could not be built. Every lost robe was a child slightly colder through the night. The Tipi did not fail the people. The people did not fail the Tipi. The foundation beneath the entire system was removed, deliberately, and the structure that had stood for centuries collapsed not from weakness but from amputation. They did not hunt the buffalo. They had entered into something older and deeper than hunting, a relationship written in survival, in gratitude, and in a necessity so complete that one could not exist without the other. And what made that relationship possible, what made every part of the system work across centuries of brutal winters, was something that left no physical trace at all. No one wrote it down. There were no manuals, no blueprints, no archived instructions waiting in a library somewhere explaining exactly how to angle the smoke flaps when the wind shifted from the northwest, or how deep to layer the sleeping robes when temperatures fell past a certain point, or how to read the behavior of embers at 2 in the morning to know whether the fire would hold until dawn. None of it existed on paper. All of it existed in people. A child growing up inside a teepee did not attend lessons about winter survival. They absorbed it the way children absorb language through proximity, repetition, and consequence. They watched a grandmother adjust the smoke flaps without being told why, and over 10 winters they understood why without ever being taught. They felt the difference between a floor layered correctly and one that was not. They knew, before anyone explained it, that the entrance faced away from the prevailing wind not because someone instructed them, but because they had felt what happened when it did not. Every elder was a library that had taken 60 winters to write. Every mother was a systems. Every child who survived to adulthood carried forward a body of knowledge, tested against the most unforgiving examination imaginable. Plains winter and refined continuously across generations, without a single generation being allowed the luxury of getting it badly wrong. And here is the part that should stop you for a moment. When colonial governments across North America began forcing native children into boarding schools, stripping them of their languages, forbidding them from speaking the words their grandmothers used, they did not only erase culture in the abstract sense that history books sometimes make it sound. They interrupted the transmission of a survival system so precise, so layered, so dependent on oral continuity, that losing even one generation of knowledge broke chains that had held through hundreds of winters. It was not just language that was taken. It was the memory of how to stay alive. They had no books. But every grandmother was a library. Every winter was a lesson that could not afford to be forgotten. And somehow, across centuries of the most brutal cold North America could produce, none of it was. Modern survival science is quietly having a humbling moment. Researchers studying cold weather gear, Arctic shelter design, and thermal retention keep arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion that the principles they are presenting as innovations are not new. Layered insulation, thermal air gaps, controlled ventilation, ground separation, shared body warmth, smoke management. Every one of these concepts existed, was tested, was refined, and was perfected on the Great Plains centuries before the first laboratory ever measured them. The sleeping pad in a modern mountaineer's pack exists because frozen ground steals heat. The ventilated hood on an Arctic jacket exists because sealed warmth without airflow is dangerous. The double-wall design of a modern expedition tent exists because a single layer of material is never enough. None of these people invented anything. They rediscovered it. And perhaps that is the most important thing this story leaves behind, not admiration for what was built, but honest reckoning with what was lost. We spent generations assuming that simpler meant inferior, that older meant less sophisticated, that a cone of poles and hide standing in a snowstorm could not possibly contain anything worth understanding. We were wrong. They did not build walls to keep nature out. They built walls that let nature in exactly as much as needed, exactly where it was useful, controlled with a precision that took centuries to develop and generations to carry forward. And somehow, inside that breathing structure, beside that careful fire, beneath those layered robes, surrounded by the warmth of everyone they loved, they stayed warmer than most of us have ever truly been. What did we lose when we stopped living this way? That question does not have a simple answer, but it is worth sitting with. If stories like this one matter to you, history that does not simplify, survival that does not romanticize, and knowledge that deserves to be remembered, then stay with us. Because the oldest lessons are still burning.